Hey everybody, here we are for another episode of the Dragonfly Paradigm Lunchtime Book Club. I am going to be sharing my thoughts and takeaways from Chapter 8 of the book again, What Happened to You by Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. And there was a lot going on in Chapter 8. The chapter is titled Our Brains, Our Biases, and Our Systems. And because there is so much to this chapter, I'm going to go ahead and break down my reactions by each category. So let's get to it. So starting with the Our Brains portion. From the beginning of this book, Dr. Perry has gone into great depth talking about how the brain works and specifically about how trauma affects the brain's ability to form appropriate and healthy reactions to all the stressors that we encounter throughout our life. Specifically on page 235, he reminds us about two important facts. That the earliest relational experiences are the most powerful and enduring, and that our first experiences create the filters through which all new experiences must pass. I think that, is really great because it lends itself into the next couple of parts of this chapter about biases. But as we remember, the brain works from the bottom up with the basic functioning and reactions happening first, and with the more complex thinking, understanding, and choosing of behaviors coming last. So, bottom up. On page 219, Oprah sums up the overall goal, I think, that we should have when we're learning about trauma and how it impacts impacts us and those around us. And that is that approaching people with the awareness that what happened to you is important, that it influences your behavior and your health, and then using that awareness to act accordingly and respond appropriately. One of the things I was surprised about learning, at least in this first part, was just how new all of this trauma research really is. On page 219, Dr. Perry gives us some dates about when various agencies were created and how it wasn't until 2018 that the CDC and other agencies came up with their principles of trauma-informed care. I was really shocked by that date. I had to kind of reread that because that's only 3 years ago. We definitely have a lot of work to do in this field for sure, and this book certainly is going a long way to help with that. Moving on to the next part of the chapter, our biases. And this part was tough, but extremely relevant for the times that we are in right now, I think. I feel that many times when we are confronted about our own implicit biases, which are those that are, deep-seated, that we are probably unaware of, we can become very defensive. Most people do not want to admit that we have any ill will at all towards any group that is deemed to be different from us. I feel that there could be really an entire chapter devoted to the language used to divide and dehumanize groups that are not deemed to be as valuable as others. Quick side note on that. If you're interested in learning more about language and how dehumanization is at the root of most conflicts between groups, then check out Brene Brown's podcast on that topic. It's amazing. But getting back to the biases, Dr. Perry says it's best on page 220, and I'm going to go ahead and just read his words in their entirety here because I feel they're quite important. But he says that I believe that if you don't recognize the built-in biases in yourself and the structural biases in your systems, biases regarding race, gender, sexual orientation, you can't truly be trauma-informed. Marginalized peoples, so excluded, minimized, shamed, are traumatized peoples. Because as we've discussed, humans are fundamentally relational creatures. To be excluded or dehumanized in an organization, community, or society you are part of results in prolonged, uncontrollable stress that is sensitizing. Marginalization is a fundamental of trauma. And those words just, they really got me. They're very powerful. And I think it also does a good job of kind of putting the work of breaking down these biases within ourselves and the systems that we are part of, that we belong to, squarely on our shoulders. The ball is in our court. No one is going to do the work for us, and we can't magically erase the atrocities that have been done to marginalized peoples and groups throughout our history. But recognition and action are what I feel is going to create the lasting change we so desperately need. And I think if we can, take the time and just stop for a moment, and instead of seeing the challenge to examine our own implicit biases as a confrontation that we need to defend, we must see it as an opportunity to learn. There's a great quote by Maya Angelou where she says, "Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better." And I think that's a great way of looking at it. The implicit biases are the ones, that we picked up from family, from cultures, from, our immediate surroundings as we're growing up. We're sometimes not even aware that we have them. So you can't necessarily, think of yourself as a bad person for having them. We just have to learn. We weren't educated the best way about people that are, unlike us or look different or whatever it may be. We have to take the control to learn and then do better. Finally, on to the last part, our systems, and there was a lot here. All of the parts about public schools really got me kind of fired up. I feel like I could spend probably an hour talking about the lack of adequate funding for public education. Anyone that has been a teacher or spent any time within the public school system probably felt a bit frustrated reading some of these pages in this chapter, because so often, no matter how much the teacher wants to help, their hands are tied by policies and procedures that are dictated to them, not to mention money. I think that so much good could be done if those in charge not only read this book, but had the resources to fund the kind of approach and methods that could benefit their students' overall emotional health and therefore the academic career. So, enough said on that, putting my soapbox away for now. But what I did like about this was that on page 229, Dr. Perry says that the typical therapy approach is not necessarily the only way to help someone heal from trauma. And I think, when they're talking about systems, they're talking about big, overarching systems of our society, like the public schools, and therapy is another part of that. But that we don't have to go through what we think of like the traditional therapist approach, laying down on a couch, that kind of thing. He actually says that on page 230 that a person's therapeutic web is a collection of positive relational-based opportunities you have throughout the day. Not only do I like that term, that kind of therapeutic web, but I like the way that he put that, because not everyone has the means or access to see a therapist. It can be very expensive. Not everybody has medical insurance that might cover something like that, or live in an area where there is, numerous therapists to choose from. But the fact I think that he's trying to get to here, as Oprah brings up, what if you don't have access to seeing a therapist? That healing can happen in the small moments with supportive family members or friends. I've talked about it before, just with the talks over ice cream cones I had with my mom at our local Dairy Queen through the years growing up. And they make mention of it in this book about the one child talking about their Cheerio moments with their mom. It's sharing those small moments over breakfast can really do as much good as an hour on a therapist's couch. So I think, there you have it for Chapter 8. It's definitely jam-packed with a lot of information, specifically about, the biases and how they can be formed, and then the systems, specifically they get into, the public schools quite a bit. And, too much to kind of, go into right now. But as I have with most chapters so far in this book, I feel an overall sense of hope. But also, like all things in this book, the hope I feel has to be used to spur me into action. So I will leave you with the final paragraph from Oprah's introduction. I think, she has such a way, of course, of summing up in a beautiful method with her words. But she says, very often what happened takes years to reveal itself. It takes courage to confront our actions, peel back the layers of trauma in our lives, and expose the raw truths of our past. But this is where the healing begins. So I hope that you have enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next week for Chapter 9.